Everyone, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I'm excited to have on today my guest co-host to talk about her show and all things that she's doing in podcasting, the great people she meets, and how she ties it back to her business where she helps authors and creative people. My guest today is amazing. I'm so excited to have her here. Desireé's here on the podcast. Desireé, welcome to the How to Podcast series.
Dave, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you and your audience.
This is going to be a lot of fun. Let's tell everybody about your show. Let's start with that.
The Books That Make You show is an extension of the Books That Make You brand. And the Books That Make You brand is all about books, authors. We do lots of fun things. The brand is a Webby Award winner. This little springy award back here is a Webby.
Come on.
And the Webbies, yeah, you recognize the Webby Awards. Mm-hmm. They're the equivalent of the Oscar Awards, but for online content. So the Books That Make You brand won a Webby Award back in 2023 for its newsletter. So Books That Make You as a brand, when I call it a brand and describe it thusly, is it's obviously a website. It's got a social media presence. It's got a newsletter, obviously, that won the award. And we created the Books That Make You show. And in all honesty, the origins of the show was not your typical type of origin story. What happened is, because I have 3 brands, this is where it gets a little complicated. But with Black Château, which is my marketing and PR agency that focuses on authors, we created Books That Make You to focus on the consumer. And then a friend of mine who worked in radio saw us posting about all of the authors that were getting interviews because of the fact that we were pitching them and getting them interviews on other shows, like even your show, podcasts, radio, etc. And this friend in radio who was running a radio station said, hey, it would be really great to have some of those authors on my radio station. And of course, as somebody who's doing PR, I was like, let's do that. Yeah. Let's book them. And he's like, oh no, but I can't host the show. I don't have time for that. And I'm like, well, that's kind of what this is all about. And he's like, what if you did a show? And that's the origin of the Books That Make You show. I used to work in radio, so it wasn't too much of a stretch for me to go from, having a background in radio, doing marketing and PR, and then creating my own show. I mean, because one of the things that folks need the most when they're starting their own podcast or their own show in this case is an audience. They need a platform. So being able to start out of the gate with it being a radio show that was going to be on the air was really helpful, because it can be so hard, as I'm sure you know, Dave, kind of building up that audience and building up that platform. So we started out as just the radio show. And shortly thereafter, it was like, we need to curate this content. Curated content is a thing in marketing and PR. Many people are very familiar with the idea of curating your podcast, curating your shows. Once people find you, they might want to take that deep dive and go back. And with radio, radio is great, but it's a flash in the pan. It's like once it's on the air, then it's gone. So that's where the Books That Make You show, as it exists today, was born as a way to interview some of our authors from the Black Château side. We did it through Books That Make You, which is that consumer-facing brand. And it is still to this day, both a radio show and a podcast. And as you're probably very familiar, we reach thousands, tens of thousands. We use YouTube as well as all of the traditional platforms like iTunes. We are actually using Spreaker. And then, we're on the radio station, MyStar95.com.
There you go. No, see, that's a great, well-rounded picture of how all this came to be. And I think that's great. I think we need that as the origin story to jump into our conversation today. How many episodes roughly do you have right at the moment?
Oh, my goodness. We've been doing this a lot. Yeah, we've been doing this since 2019. Wait, no, 2018. And we try to do a weekly show. Sometimes we take a little time off. So, do the math. There's a lot.
Well, that's good. And you mentioned before we hit record, you had some really notable guests on your show. Every guest is notable. But you had some pretty interesting people on the show. You want to run through a few of those names?
Oh, yeah. Some of our dear guests and people, authors, that's the thing. It's usually authors or somebody has something to do with the publishing world. Barbara Eden, who you may remember from I Dream of Jeannie. She
Yeah.
actually won an award for her children's book, which was ironically enough about a genie and exploring and, opening kids' eyes up to the world that's out there. So she was absolutely lovely. Mark Kennedy Shriver was another one of our guests. Again, he wrote a children's book. And a lot of people know the Kennedys and they know the Shriver name. He was obviously a former politician and just somebody who's so generous and giving and caring with his story and what he does for kids. We had Jason Baldoni, who is an actor. A lot of people recognize him. He's also a director, a producer. His book was called Man Enough, which really kind of turned on its tail the notions of what it means to be a man and masculinity. And we've just had so many authors. I mean, again, we've had so many shows. So off the top of my head, those are a few that stand out. But what I love too is being able to give a voice to first-time authors or somebody who just released their first book, and giving their book and their story, their background, a way to reach so many other people.
What has changed for you as the host of the show? How are you changing? How are you improving? There's after that many episodes, there's got to be some things that are a little easier than they were at the beginning. How kind of growth are you seeing for yourself?
Fine-tuning, really zeroing in on getting the questions and the information, the show prep. Prepping for a show is something that is ingrained into you when you do radio. It's like prep. What's your show prep? And pretty much got it down to a science at this point. And being able to zero in on what the message of that author's book is. With it being called The Books That Make You Show, we have a little bit of fun with that name. So every show is books that make you, and then based on the author's book, their brand, their messaging, that's where we fill in the blank. And that's the focus of the show. Of course, we talk about other things, using the authors, whether they give us talking points or a press release or some kind of backgrounder, or even just a copy of the book. Sometimes being able to go through the chapter headlines and paging through it, reading it to get an idea of what it is that their ultimate message is. But I feel that it's really important to focus on a message, an aspect of their brand in order to really make the show successful and make them shine.
So what about someone listening and they have a business, they have a service similar to what you might do or something a little different, but they've never considered how a podcast could feed into their business and make a connection that way? Any words of wisdom for someone who hasn't considered podcasting as an arm of what they do to serve their community?
Think of it, and that's the thing. So many different businesses could come at it from different ways. Now, off the top of my head, maybe you're a real estate executive. You sell real estate, and you might think to yourself, why should I do a podcast? What's that going to do? Well, the real estate market and understanding the trends and the different areas of whether it's your own community, which I think you might want to focus on, or the state that you live in, or even the country, can really help impact your business. So in this scenario, thinking about what it is that your community, what are your potential clients looking for? Because by doing a show, you're putting yourself, your expertise, and your business in the spotlight. And real estate, again, I just pulled that out of the air, but it's a good example because we don't need realtors until we need realtors. And branding is so important in that sense because you want to be able to think, hey, I've been watching this show with this realtor, and now I'm finally in the market to sell my house. I need to call this person. So I think that the most important thing for somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast is really taking a look at your business, at your audience, and the messaging that you want to get out there to potential clients, and then weaving that into your show's content to truly be successful.
That's good. That's a good example too. I've been thinking about my wife and I just purchased some real estate, and I talked to the agent. Of course, my wife rolls her eyes. I'm like, you should have a podcast to the agent. And she's like, why? Why would I do that? I'm like, well, we live in Niagara, and a lot of people come to Niagara to see Niagara Falls, and it's a tourist area. But you could do a podcast about the local community and then self-sponsor it and say, if you're looking to move to this area of the world, I'd love to help you find your next home. I like to be there for you as a resource. So again, having that person in your ears, building community. As a listener of a podcast, you begin to feel like you know the host, even though you've never met them before. So you're building a trust bond with your audience just by doing a podcast on a regular basis. You're going to be the first person they reach out to because they feel like they already know you and you've never met them. So I like how you're framing the real estate agent. That's a good example.
Yeah, exactly.
So for your podcast, how are you growing then? You have grown, but how are you continuing to grow to do your podcast better, and you're improving? What kind of tools are you using to improve yourself as a host?
It's a combination of good old-fashioned advertising as well as public relations and using social media. So each show that we do, we create a promo that goes with it. I actually record that at the end of the show because at that point, the guest has been warmed up. They've already answered the questions. And then it's like 30 seconds, like a very short promo. We primarily air that promo on TikTok. That's one of the ways that we feed our TikTok content. And the way I look at this is we are feeding our content machines. We constantly hear about content and content being king and how do you get your content out there? So I'm looking for ways to streamline the creation of our content rather than just constantly saying, we need content. Let's go out and create this brand new thing. Weaving it into what we're already doing makes it more streamlined. It makes it more efficient, and it actually makes it more effective too. And in the terms of podcasting, hitting people up with small clips, little reels, things that can be shared on reels on social media is important. So again, we record that promo. It's primarily done for TikTok, just a little bit of editing to make us, kind of look like we should in a vertical design on TikTok. And then we also play that on our other social media, our Meta, our Facebook and Instagram. And so we're sharing that on the different platforms, as well as on YouTube. We're on YouTube as well. And we do advertising on YouTube, but being able to share those clips on YouTube, the shorts, as a lot of people know them, is really a great way to introduce people to the show, especially in a time, our era, we all have attention deficit disorder, don't we? We want fast things. So if we're scrolling really fast and we see this reel on Instagram and it grabs our attention, well, then that pulls them over to the full show. Our show is a half-hour long show. It's a fairly long show. So in order to promote it, we want to grab their attention with those pithy, quick shorts. And we also play them or air them, I should say, include them in our newsletter. So our approach in distributing that little piece of content that promotes the show is multi-pronged. It's not like we're just using it for one thing. Yeah, we're using it on TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and all the social medias. We're putting it out there in our newsletter. And then if we want to, in many cases, we're advertising the channel as well. We tend to do most of our advertising on the YouTube platform. Depending upon what kind of a podcast one does, you can certainly do audio only. I feel that if you're going to do audio, it's just a couple of extra steps to do video. Not that it doesn't introduce its own challenges for you, but by having the video aspect and having YouTube, which is a very large channel, or a platform, I should say, by having a channel there, it really increases your audience and exposure.
That's great. Those are all great tips. I like that. As we do podcasting, the one thing that I've noticed with my author podcast, Living the Next Chapter, it's about 3 years old. I have 450 episodes. I'm doing 3 a week. And one thing I notice is I have all these great connections with new authors that I've just met through the show. But what happens after? Like the episode goes live, we send all our stuff to them, we ask them to share. And then there's the time after that, where there's like 2, 3 months, a year later. And we've built this bridge with a guest, but how do we nurture that relationship? I don't want to just bring someone in, do an interview, and then say goodbye and never talk to them again. Do you have anything in the background that you do for your show where you keep in touch with your guests? You stay part of their world? Is there anything that you do?
And social media, a lot of guests stay with us. It depends upon the platforms that they're on, but many of them, I watch their journey and support it. We have a lot of return guests too. With the world of authors, as I'm sure you know, once somebody writes a book, chances are they're going to write a second book, whether it be a series or a separate standalone book. So there's many of our authors who we've had back again and again. I think there's some authors, I think the record that we currently have is we have one guest who's been on the show 7 times because he's very prolific, releasing a lot of books, and he's delightful to have. So I think staying in touch, again, I'm a big fan of email marketing. So making sure that they're on your email list so that they're aware of you, subscribing to their email list, not unsubscribing from their email list. I take very much to heart the fact that when somebody's on the show and then they put me on their email list, I'm going to stick with them. And that's a great way for them to remind themselves or remind me of what they're doing. And then likewise, that email marketing is another platform. So between email, social media, staying in touch. And we also do other things too. We do the BookFest. A lot of authors who have been on the Books That Make You show then see that we do the BookFest, which is an online event. It's a podcast in the sense that it does air on channels like this, but it's also an online event. So there's a lot of reciprocation. There's a lot of networking within the community and making sure that we just stay connected and stay informed. And in the case of the BookFest, when we put out our call for speakers and ideas, we have a lot of former Books That Make You guests that then see that, and then they pitch themselves to possibly be on a panel or speak in a conversation at the BookFest.
That's good. I like that. And I also like bringing back content from like years ago or months ago where our audience today may be finding us for the first time. They haven't gone back into 2018, 2019. They haven't listened to those episodes. That's great quality content, great authors, great stories. And somehow if we can bring that content forward for our audience, because we have new listeners all the time, new viewers all the time, how do we let them know that, hey, there's a lot of great content in the show that you can go back and hear. So anytime you can bring little clips or share that again online, I'll take a guest from episode 1, episode 10. Again, we're in the 450s now, and I'll reintroduce it as if it's a new content because the content's evergreen. The conversation is great, and they're a great author, and I really want to focus on them. They reshare it as an author. It's a reminder, oh, the time I went on to Desiree's podcast was so much fun, and they're going to reshare it again. You regenerate that content, so don't be afraid of going back into your library. If you're listening to this and listening to Desiree, don't be afraid to go back to your content and reintroduce it to your audience again, because there's new people in the room. They don't know anything about what's happened in the past. So leverage that content. It's there for you, right?
That's such a great point. Yeah. And keeping some of your content evergreen, like you're saying, even thinking in terms of however you categorize your library and, keep track of things. But even if you're just checking a box, oh, this is evergreen content. And then very much to your point, re-releasing that. You can even put that into, if you have a content calendar. If you are, whether it's a social media calendar or your newsletter, again, however you're managing your content, to then say, every third Friday of the month, we do a flashback. And it's a flashback to a piece of evergreen content. And that way you're recycling. And very much like I mentioned before, it's really important because we're all busy, aren't we, David?
Right.
The fact that you're doing 3 shows a week, bravo to that. I'm like, oh, I can sometimes barely do one, but it's a lot of. Yeah. And so to be able to repurpose that content really turns your content into something that gets shared even farther and wider than it possibly did in its first go around.
It's that stone on the hill that you give it a little push and it starts to roll down the hill and it starts collecting and getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolls, and it goes faster and faster and faster. That's our content. We start off at the top of the hill with a little idea, give it a little push, and down the hill it goes, and if things just get attracted to it, and it gets bigger and bigger, and your audience will grow over time. The more episodes you have, the more content is available to your audience to enjoy, And you'll see those numbers continue to rise because there's more to pick from. It's not just 10 episodes. You have 100, 200, 300 episodes. Your audience will be like, wow, Desiree's like got so much great content here. And I start on one episode and then I start listening to all. I don't know about you, but when I find a great show that I really enjoy, I'm the type of person to go back to episode 1 and start listening and start going through the content because I just want to fall in love with that host. So you never know. You might have a super fan who is going to find your show and go right back to the beginning and start listening. That's great when you look at your stats and you see that happening. That's a great listener for your show.
Exactly. That's such a great point. I agree with you 100%.
Okay, so what are you doing beyond your business and how you help authors to attract more guests to your show? We're always looking for great guests to come on our podcast. I know you help people with this, which we could talk about. But for those that are trying to find great guests for their podcast, there's free Facebook groups. There's services you can pay for online to find guests. But do you have any tips for us on how to find a great guest for our next podcast episode?
Wow, that is something that I've never had a problem with. Once you create a show, it's generally a matter of them coming to you. And whether your show, I mean, you probably have a website or some kind of contact information. So making sure that you put that out there. You can even promote that within your show. Or again, on your website, have, if you want to be a guest on the show, click here. You can have a form on your website so that people can give you a little bit of information. Or if they're emailing you, just let them know the materials that you need from them in order to make that decision. Publicists, people who promote books, again, that's the Black Château side of my business. I know that when we're reaching out to guests, it's a matter of finding a show listed. There's different lists that are out there. So whether it's Podcaster or some of these types of platforms and lists, once you get integrated into that, the publicists will start coming to you and pitching you. And then it's just a matter of looking at the guest and deciding which ones you may be interested in booking. I do think, and maybe I'm a little bit biased in this, but when you're working with an author or a guest that has a publicist or somebody behind them, as a general rule, that means that that guest has worked with somebody to get their interview skills up to par. It can be a little frustrating if you're just starting out your podcast to invite somebody on your show and then realize that they're not ready to even be interviewed. Being interviewed, being a guest on a show, a lot of times means being prepared to speak in terms of your messaging, your sound bites. What is it that you want to say? What is the show generally about? Again, if it's a show about real estate, the person who might have written a book about, I'll use an example. This is one of our authors. His book is Mellow Your Money, and it's all about managing your wealth and investing, right? And one of his talking points happens to be about the real estate market. He also talks about cryptocurrency. He can also talk about the history of investing. So he has all these different verticals, all these different types of shows that he would be a great guest on. So when you are the host of the show, having some structure to the type of show that you provide, again, if it's real estate, then you're going to zero in on those talking points that have to do with real estate and real estate investing and what to look for in, certain markets, et cetera, et cetera. So making sure that your show is well defined so that the guest knows what they need to bring to the table, and just making sure that they're prepared for you. Again, if they have a publicist or somebody that they're working with, chances are they've had some media training, they know their talking points, they know how to deliver a great show. And David, I know you do something that I think is really smart. Even before we did this interview we're doing right now, you and I just chatted. It's like, set up a call, let's talk. That way you got an idea of what kind of guest I was going to be. I, as a guest, got an idea what kind of a host you're going to be, what kind of show we're going to do. So whether you're doing something similar to David and doing a pre-interview screening call, and I work with a lot of show hosts who do that too, whether they want to call or they want to have a quick Zoom session, They want to get a feel for the guest first. So making sure that that guest is ready for you so that as you're interviewing them, you are helping them deliver their best possible messaging and making a really great show for you, because that's reciprocal, isn't it?
Right.
The guest is there to help your show, but your show is there to help your guest. And when you have that win-win situation, everything comes together. That's when it's truly awesome and effective.
Yeah. And part of the reason why I do that pre-interview was I have a lot of authors who have never been on a podcast before. This is the first time they've ever done this. I've had people come on and say, my publicist sent me here. I don't even know what a podcast is. They're like, can you explain what we're doing here? Like, is this a radio show? Like, is there people watching me right now? And I'm like, no. That's not how we're doing this episode. So I was able to help them. And what I love is watching an author who feels nervous or a little intimidated by the process of being on a show, watching their shoulders drop and feel more relaxed before we go into the recording part of this so that we have a better conversation. They don't feel like they have to be perfect. They don't feel like every word is being reviewed by somebody off camera. There's no one here to watch you make a mistake. Mistakes can be corrected in editing. They're just like, oh, so I don't have to be perfect to be on your show? No. You don't have to be perfect to be on this show. And you can see their shoulders drop and they feel more relaxed and they feel more engaged, and the conversation benefits, I think, by doing that little pre-interview. It's a big ask for people to talk to you twice, but I find from my audience response, they like the fact that we put time and effort into the podcast, that we actually plan this out and we have a plan for our conversation. So it kind of works that way for me and my show, and it's had some really good benefits. I'm curious from your perspective, Desireé, for a podcast host, how can we be better at dealing with someone who's coming to us from a PR agency, promoting to us a guest? How can we be better you must see the other side of us as hosts, where you're reaching out to hosts and they never get back to you, or there's probably a million stories that you have about us as hosts of podcasts. How can we be better working with and alongside a PR agency to make it better for the guest? How can we do a better job on our end?
I think that what you're doing with the pre-interview is really brilliant. And whether that host is doing something similar or they have a one sheet, some kind of information that just lays out what their show is about. It's like just the facts. Give me just the facts, ma'am. Because whether it's a publicist or a booking agent or somebody, they're going really fast. And a lot of times they need to know, okay, this is a half-hour show. It's going to be a podcast. It's also a radio show, or it's on this platform. The host likes to do things this way. Because very much like you're doing now, every host, every show is different. So just knowing what that is, a one sheet, a fact sheet, that can take us so many different places. Or a form, again, if you have some kind of a form on the website so that the publicist or the booking agent can provide that information, and it's just simple, fast, and easy. And that way we, as the PR team, can prep the author or the guest for that, making sure that that guest, like you talk about first-time guests, somebody who's never been on a show. And by the way, shame on that publicist who would just give you a person without explaining what's going on, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're kind of like these middle people, right? We've got the hosts over here and the guest over here. And it's my job as a PR pro to get our guests up to speed. So they're going to want to know, what's this, how long is the show? What do they want to talk about? What's this guest like? What is this? And in some cases, they might not want to be on that show. So we're kind of in the middle, making sure everything is scheduled and everything happens the right way. And just keeping in mind too, that we need to remain in the middle. Every once in a while, we'll run into a show where it's like, oh, we want to just talk to the author directly and book them and do all of this stuff. What happens then, from our point of view, what can happen is then we don't even know when the show is happening. and we have to report back to our client because that author is our client. This is a client relationship for us.
Yep.
Whereas with the guest and the podcaster, that's a different type of relationship.
Smart.
And it's difficult for us if a show gets booked without our knowledge, and then our client comes back and says, what about XYZ show? When did that air? Have you heard anything back from them? And if we're suddenly taken out of the loop, we can't know what we don't know. So I think understanding that a publicist or a marketing and PR firm like myself, we're there to help both parties, and we're beholden to both parties. And it's all about relationships, David. That's why it was so wonderful when we first started talking. It's like, hey, let's jump on a call. Let's talk. Because those relationships matter. Much like you were asking me in the beginning, how do you keep in touch with all of your guests? Well, we're also keeping in touch with all of our hosts. And we have a list of hosts and people that we know. And we'll reach out and say, hey, you know what? We've got this new author. She's a little bit shy, this is a big ask for her. And that's the thing too about authors, which I'm sure you realize. A lot of them would prefer to be writing their novel, hiding. They don't want to be on the stage. So knowing that, hey, let's have this new author talk with David as one of her first shows, that and knowing you and how you interact with the guests and how you do the interviews, that all speaks volumes. And, from our point of view, we will use that. And so in speaking now to somebody who's thinking about starting a podcast, just remember the publicists, the people that are booking, they're your friends. So not only can they help you get that one guest, but then once you get to know them, they can get you countless guests. And you're going to know that those guests are prepared to talk on your show, are prepped. You're going to get all the materials that you need. And materials can vary. Every show it can vary. And it just goes to how they promote the show. A headshot, the book cover, a copy of the book, an arc of the book, physical copy of the book, the bio, the talking points. There's a whole list of potential material that you as a host will probably want. And in our case, we virtually send it out to everybody because we know that you're going to probably need some variations of this. But even realizing, hey, I can go through this bio. I don't have to research online this guest. They just sent me their bio. So being able to utilize the publicist and the PR firm, because they're going to get you the materials that you need. If you need the headshot for the author because you're going to make a graphic, well, they've got that information for you. And in some cases, you might find this too. The author themselves might have a hard time even emailing their book cover JPEG or finding their own headshot. So the last thing you want to do as a host is be tracking down or chasing down any graphics or images that you might need to help promote them on your show.
Okay, that's interesting because I'm really looking forward to working with you guys over at your business as well, because you have so many great authors that you represent and you help. So I'm looking forward to that because I can tell you, I have a few PR agencies, when they email me, it's an automatic yes, because we've worked together in the past. They know my show. They know me. They've sent me amazing people. And, we've got past that awkward first email where we don't know each other, and now we work together. So again, as soon as that email comes in, it's like they don't even need to ask. They're just like, yep, got another author for you. Here you go. And it's like, okay, let's go. So I trust them completely because they always serve me great guests. So once you make that connection with a PR agency that you trust, and the PR agency trusts you as a host, you have that mutual relationship going on where you serve each other. We're here to help you do what you do, and you're here to help me do what I do. So I love that. What about for a guest that's working through your agency? Is there anything that you encourage them to do for a podcast host that we would like to know as a host that would benefit us as well? Is there any kind of instruction you give to your guests?
Oh, absolutely. For us in particular, and I can't speak to how other publicists do their work because everybody, as you just indicated, is a little bit different. But we actually go through branding sessions with all of our authors. I call them branding sessions. I know sometimes the term branding is bandied around and it feels a little bit ethereal and it doesn't have any substance to it. In terms of the way I look at branding, it's the foundation, it's the message you need to get out to the world. And sometimes those messages get very convoluted, especially for authors, because they've written a 300-page book. They have a hard time focusing on what their actual message is. I've had authors who couldn't even tell me their own log line, which is a little bit scary. I've had authors who just want to jump around from topic to topic. So what we do during these branding sessions is I start digging into the core of their messaging and I ask them a few questions and I'll share with you so that people who are, thinking about becoming a guest or even podcast hosts can think in these terms as well, because I think it helps. One of the very first things I ask is why you? Why you for this show?
Mm.
The host or the producer that I'm dealing with is going to be thinking to themselves, why do I want to have this guest on my show? And I, as the PR firm, need to answer that. And they, as the guest, need to answer that. This dude who wrote a book about finance and money, why this guy instead of all of the other possible finance guys that are out there? What does he bring to the table? And that usually equates to something unique in their brand messaging, their core. I've had authors say this to me. I've read all the books on leadership, and I now distill into my book all of the ideas on leadership. I'm like, what makes that different? Why is that different than all the other leadership books? You've actually just told me that you're just going to be regurgitating what's already out there. Right. There's a great book called Purple Cow. It's an old book, but it's one of my favorite books on branding. And it's a very short read if anybody's interested in it. Purple Cow's basic premise, and I saw you kind of laugh a little bit.
I'm writing it down as you say it, yes.
You're writing it down. But you kind of get it just from the title, right? Purple Cow. Yeah. You're driving through the fields and you see cow after cow after cow. None of them grab your attention. They're all just cow. Why that cow? I don't know. And then you see a purple cow. Well, it grabs your attention. So that's what I'm looking for in the why you when I start working on branding with the authors. And then I'll drill down into their individual talking points. Now, Mr. Mick Hyman here, who I've been using as an example, you can see too, I go through and I make notes as we're doing the branding sessions. His book is nonfiction. And you might find this too, David. Nonfiction authors and nonfiction books are probably a lot easier to pitch, which is what the publicist is doing, and a lot easier to book because mellow your money, how to surf the market and build wealth without stressing yourself out. That's kind of the pitch right there. You right, get it. Yeah. And again, I kind of mentioned we can talk about, politics with him, real estate, all these different markets. And it's all about mellow your money. You don't need to be stressing out about it. And that's different. That grabs your attention. That's a purple cow. Now, when it comes to fiction, that's a little bit different. And I actually know publicists and PR firms that won't even take on fiction authors because they're harder. They are so much harder to book onto shows. They're harder to a lot of times get those messages and really fine tune what it is that the host can talk to about. In the world of fiction, a lot of the authors, even more so than in nonfiction, are the kind that want to go off and sit in their cabin in the woods and just write. Don't look at me. Don't talk to me. I want my writing to speak for itself. So it's a matter of drawing them out and finding messages that resonate within the theme of their book that they can speak to, side of getting too lost, too mired down in the nitty-gritty. Have you ever talked to a fiction author and they start wanting to talk to you, well, I made this character and in chapter 8, they do this and this thing and that thing. They start regurgitating their synopsis to you. And so I encourage the fiction authors, don't regurgitate the synopsis. You're going to lose people. But what is your theme? What's your overarching ta-da about this book? And by the way, this is Rebecca Hendricks, and I've got her second book right behind me. Just launched the second book. It's called Hard Dog's Night. Hound Dogged was her first book. And in her book, she has two competing bands back in the 1950s, rock and roll bands, right? And that's interesting thing to talk about. But in doing her branding, we discovered that she has a real penchant for rock and roll history. And even though she's not a historian, and we're always careful, we don't want to position somebody as something that they're not. It's not like she's got a PhD in rock and roll history, but she's researched this to the moon and back. So she can talk about things like Elvis Presley appearing on Ed Sullivan and why they could only shoot him from the waist up, why it was called the devil's music, and the impact that rock and roll had on society. And she can talk about even, think about back in the 50s, how, evil and awful this rock and roll music was, and how nowadays we look at, Elvis Presley, Beatles as being relatively tame because the times change.
Yeah.
So that's just an example of going beyond the story and finding themes with that fiction author and things that they can talk about outside the bounds of what you might typically find in an interview with an author. And even with Rebecca, I'll add one more point too, is sometimes with fiction authors, you look for something else, some kind of a hobby or thing that they do that might not necessarily directly tie into their book. But if they talk about that, they can also then, in the course of that interview, bring up the fact that they're an author. Again, you're kind of looking for all these different verticals to pitch. She's an urban explorer. Do you know what that is?
Well, yeah, I've heard of lots of people telling me about that. That's amazing.
She can talk about, she's from Colorado. So she can talk about urban exploration in Colorado. She can talk about the time when she was urban exploring in Mexico, and that did not go as planned. She can even talk about tips and things to do if you want to do urban exploration. So we've got this whole other area and topic that she can talk about. And so to circle back around to your point, it's all about getting the author prepped and ready to do those interviews, to deliver the messages that they want to get out there, in order to give you, David, or any other podcast host, a really great show that can cover, the topics that you feel are relevant.
That's great. And then for me, I host 8 different podcasts. So I had an example where I had a dad came on to talk about a book that he wrote, and he also has a podcast. So I had him on my Dad Space podcast to talk about his dad journey. I had him on Living the Next Chapter to talk about his author book and then what he had written. And I also had him on my How to Podcast series, which we're doing right now, to talk about his podcast. So one guest, 3 different shows from one email, right? And 3 different total audiences that had they don't blend at all. They're totally different. But we were able to have the same person 3 times and still be able to talk about his book all 3 times. And just be able to promote him in 3 different ways to 3 different audiences. So that can happen as well. So that's another bonus to this podcasting space that I really like. One thing I do with my nonfiction authors that do get really introverted and kind of into their topic, and I try to pull them out in the interview, is I'll ask them a question like, okay, so your main character walks into the room and sits down with you right now in this moment, and I'm not here. It's just you and that main character from your book. What's one question you have for them that you don't know the answer to? What would you ask them? And you can see them go, wow, like I've created this person, this content, this story. I've created this world. I've created this character. And I have to ask them a question I don't know the answer to. And they're like, you can see their mind turning. They're spinning. And they're like, and then the light bulb goes off. They're like, I don't know the answer. Did you ever meet your mother? I don't know that. Oh, I'd love to know about that story, right? You could see them kind of open up in that moment. And then when we're all done and we stop recording, they're like, I think I just got the idea for my next book. I'm like, well, that's great. That's awesome. So being able to pull that stuff out of your guest is so much fun. I love that.
It's really brilliant that you do that, David. And I can see how authors who might have never thought in those terms before have that aha moment. That is really great.
I love those. And again, it's happening real time for my audience and for me at the same time. So they're experiencing in the moment just like I am. So it doesn't feel scripted. It doesn't feel like it was pre-planned or we're reading from a script. It just happened naturally. And I love that for my audience. And they respond back. They're like, oh my gosh, I feel like I was in the room with Desireé. As you were asking her that question, I felt like I was right there. And that was the question I would have asked if I was in the room, and it just happened. It's so cool. Yeah. So I love representing my audience that way. It's great. Desireé, as we wrap up, I would love for you to kind of talk more about your business and how you serve your community, and we'll send people to you. But any parting words for a podcaster on continuing with their show? We get to that point where it becomes, sometimes for people, it becomes work, becomes an effort to do the next episode. But how can we encourage somebody to keep going forward? But again, as well, tell us more about your business, because I'd love to send people to you as well.
Sure. I think as far as podcasters, do what you love first. Do it because it's a passion. And I know, David, you and I chatted a little bit. You're doing this because you love it. It's fun. It's exciting. Think of a topic that is going to entertain you as much as it's going to entertain your audience, because then I feel you can't go wrong. If you're doing this, we'll go back to real estate. If you're thinking, oh my God, I work in real estate, but the last thing I want to do is talk about real estate when I get home. But you know what? I love collecting dolls. Dolls are my passion. Maybe your podcast is about dolls. And then very much like you've done, David, I would think that podcaster, once they get up and running, they can segment into other topics. So maybe they do that very business-focused real estate show. But maybe in addition to collecting dolls, they also like to go on road trips. So they have a travel show. So start by doing what you love. And don't worry about comparing yourself to the other shows that are out there that have millions of subscribers. The subscribers and the views and the watches, the audience, that will all come in time. And as you grow and develop your show, you'll find different avenues to promote it. Again, whether that's through traditional advertising, social media, starting a newsletter, doing stuff like this too, David. I mean, we're two hosts talking about podcasting. So as a podcast host, you might want to find other hosts that you've been listening to and say, hey, I'm starting a show. Come on my show. Go on your show. And you start doing that community building that I think can help podcasters so much.
Smart. Now take us to your business. How can we work with you? I know there's authors that listen to this that would love to be part of your community. Where do we go and how do we connect with you around your business?
Sure. So Desireé Duffy, I have 3 brands because I don't know. It's just so why not, right? Black Château is our PR marketing agency. That was our first brand. That's PR marketing agency that promotes authors. So part of what we do is have authors on great shows, just like with David. And we also do advertising and lots of other promotions with our authors. And then we have Books That Make You, which I mentioned, and it's the Books That Make You show that I do. That is our consumer-facing brand. So even though people might not have heard of Black Château, much like in the world of marketing and PR, you might not have heard of the agency Ogilvy, but Ogilvy is behind a lot of the brands and promotions and advertising that's out there in the world. So Books That Make You, you can come and visit the website, booksthatmakeyou.com, just like it's blackchateauenterprises.com. And you can find out more about authors. You can subscribe to our Books That Make You show, our newsletter. And for authors, we also do editorial style reviews. So very much like a Kirkus does, we do book reviews. And so that serves the reading community because they're primarily for readers, but authors who want, that editorial type review, a lot of times you find it on the back of the book, something that even is part of the book production, even before the book is released. We help authors with that and many promotions as well. And then the third brand, David, is the BookFest. And the BookFest was not a brand. It's like that unexpected third child, right? It's like, I didn't know I was going to have another baby.
Hang on. Yeah.
It came out of COVID when everybody was kind of having lockdown. We created an online event, the BookFest, and we've been going strong ever since. It happens twice a year, and day one is always for the reader. Day two is for the writer because the audience is segregated that way. So the BookFest happens in the spring and the fall. And I encourage people to go to thebookfest.com. That is thebookfest.com. Yeah, we even got the registered trademark for our event, and it's free to attend. So if you love books, check it out. You can become a subscriber. We send out a VIP gift bag of digital downloads after each BookFest. It's totally free. We're an online community. And for authors who are interested in being part of the BookFest, you just watch for our call for speakers and ideas that we put out every season. And we also do the BookFest Awards. And people, even right now, up until mid-September, people can enter to win a BookFest Award where their book would be considered. And we do a very beautiful bookish montage of all the winners at each BookFest. We offer great incentives to, for example, many of our BookFest Award winners, I'll invite to be on the book or the Books That Make You show. We also have different promotional opportunities like getting people up on Times Square with their book and other opportunities as well, like at the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books. So I encourage people to check it out. It's thebookfest.com, booksthatmake.you.com, and Black Château Enterprises.
There you go. We have the trifecta. All three are great ways to connect with Desireé and her team. And I'm so excited that you have time to be on the show. We're going to have you back to talk Living the Next Chapter and talk specifically to the authors that listen in that community. So I'm excited for that. And I'm excited to see those emails coming from Black Château on all these great authors in the future that I can host on my podcast. I'm really looking forward to working with you as well, Desireé. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, David.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast all the way through to the end. I love having these great guest co-hosts on the show to share their podcasts with you. You have some homework to do. And what I'm asking of you is to go check out our featured guest co-host today. Go over and listen to their podcast. The links are always in the show notes. And I'd love for you to go and give them your love and support. And I think if we can all do that for each other, podcasting will be a lot more fun for all of us. So it's time to do what you've asked others to do for you. It's time to do for this guest co-host. Links in the show notes. Go over and check out their show and leave them a review, do the follow, go listen to their episodes in full, the entirety of an episode, which again shows to the apps that it's a good podcast because you're going there and you're staying to the end. It's probably one of the best ways you can help a podcaster grow their audience and be shown to more people is by simply going and listening wherever you listen to the very end, like you're doing right now here. This is the perfect way to signal to wherever you're listening on, this is a podcast worth promoting. And all of the apps want you to stay on as long as possible. So go over and listen to our guest co-host episode and leave them some feedback. If they have a buy me a coffee, send them a coffee. If they have a speak pipe, send them a voice message. If they have an email, send them an email. If they're on Instagram, send them a direct message. Do something to support our guest co-hosts. They've given up their time to be here with you, to be here with me, and we can give that back to them with time and attention, our love, our support. Thank you for doing all that for me as well. Here on the How to Podcast series, we'll talk to you soon for our next episode.